Yesterday, Netflix released a new documentary on the investigation of Lucy Letby. Despite the fact that the trailer was fairly painful for me to watch, it was incumbent upon myself as a prominent creator on YouTube to both watch this documentary and respond to it. Both the trailer and documentary featured footage that could reasonably be described as intrusive. Lucy Letby was depicted being arrested in her parents' home, and Susan and John Letby broke their over 2-year silence in order to respond to this ordeal. In a Sunday Times article, Lucy Letby's parents outlined the fact that they were given no warning about this arrest. They also pointed out that both themselves and Lucy had cooperated fully with the police. Indeed, this is not contested. The police have specifically described her as cooperative, although their description here of Lucy being calm is highly doubtful. Stunned and terrified would seem to be more accurate. It is also important to note that Lucy's parents attended Blacon Police Station in Chester in March 2017 to report that the hospital consultants Dr. Stephen Breary and Dr. Ravi Jairam were, in the words of Lucy's parents, making Lucy a scapegoat. This is important because Breary and Jairam would later attend a meeting with Cheshire Police on the 15th of May 2017, also at Blacon Police Station in Chester. This was instrumental in the decision of Cheshire Police to open an investigation into events at the Council Chester Hospital. As previous to this, the police constabulary had acknowledged that there was no evidence of a criminal act and had spoken with executives from the hospital on the 12th of May 2017, indicating that there was no basis for a criminal investigation. Having previously been informed that Breary and Jairam were scapegoating Lucy Letby, the police allowed these two individuals to be the driving force behind their investigation. If this wasn't bad enough, by their own admission, Cheshire Police then involved Dr. Breary and Dr. Jairam in the investigation. One might hope that this is a figment of my imagination, but not only do we know this to be true, but Cheshire Police in fact gleefully reported this shambolic conduct to both the Observer and Vanity Fair. It was further confirmed by statements made by both Dr. Breary and Dr. Jairam during the trial of Lucy Letby. Despite the fact that the matter was referred to the police with, by their own admission, no evidence, Cheshire Police would later, in July 2025, arrest the 3 executives with whom they had agreed there was no basis to investigate. This seems little more than a frivolous and indefensible attempt to protect their own narrative rather than a legitimate investigation. Leaving aside footage included in this documentary, which has already been widely condemned as distasteful, the whole escapade is immediately controversial. Cheshire Police have evidently engaged in a tendering process for this film, which has attracted strong criticism due to its emotive and intrusive nature. Furthermore, there is enormous doubt regarding the legitimacy of Lucy Letby's conviction. There's been a prominent, highly credible and well-publicised campaign which will be discussed in the documentary. This recently resulted in the Sun newspaper featuring Lucy Letby's case on its front page, declaring it to be potentially the miscarriage of justice of the century. The Sun newspaper later ran a poll in which over 75% of readers indicated that they believe Lucy Letby should have a retrial. This is significant as the Sun newspaper is not only a hugely popular and widely read publication, but also historically has been an enthusiastic defender of the criminal justice system. This brief overview is important context to understand before we examine this Netflix documentary. So the first thing to say about this documentary is that it devotes quite a lot more time to the police aspects of this than the aspects pointing to this being a miscarriage of justice. I think I can say fairly that if this had been a credible documentary, there would have been approximately 1 minute of nonsense from Cheshire Police and then 1 hour and 29 minutes of evidence from the dozens of doctors and scientists who are now acting in Lucy Letby's defence, not to mention the hundreds that support this position and are commenting online. I've interviewed over 60 for my forthcoming book on the Lucy Letby case, and I'm in continual contact with many more. There's some weird AI stuff in this documentary which has been criticised in some quarters. I can understand why they've done this, but it does leave a bit of an unpleasant taste in the mouth nevertheless. But the documentary began with some shaky body cam footage of Lucy's arrest, and we discover that Simon Blackwell conducted the arrest, and overall this footage is rather disturbing. I'm not going to dwell too much on this footage in this review because it's intrusive and unethical, and it should never have happened. Frankly, I wouldn't have shelled out the £6 to watch this documentary if people weren't expecting me to review it. It arguably shouldn't have happened if Lucy Letby was definitively guilty, but under these circumstances where there is enormous doubt and a huge number of experts coming forward to support her innocence, I think to show this type of footage is indefensible, frankly. Simon Blackwell's previous major contribution was to comment in the promotional film that Cheshire Police made that child baby deaths are rare. This simply isn't true, but then he goes on to say that you hardly ever hear about it. Well, the reason you don't hear about it, Simon, is because it's dealt with as an internal medical matter and the police don't investigate it. So Simon Blackwell's already proven himself to be not exactly brain of Britain, and he will continue to do that in this documentary. The arrest of Lucy Letby was horrific and certainly traumatising for me. I can only imagine what it's like for people that know her. Presumably her parents won't watch this, but it's pretty horrendous. It was very upsetting. I did not enjoy watching large parts of this film, nor did I particularly enjoy making this video, but it was something that I was required to do. So we see Lucy arrested in bed. The timeline of everything that occurs in this documentary is not made entirely clear. It's notable that one police officer is anonymised. The police are keen to anonymise their own agents, but they're happy to put out this incredibly intrusive, deeply inappropriate documentary, which frankly just simply shouldn't exist. Lucy looks bemused and terrified, and even at this point, I would like viewers to consider the decision made by Cheshire Police to commercially benefit from this horrific and traumatic scene. Lucy then asks to see her cat. I'm not going to go over the rest of these scenes very much, but we do see Lucy wanting to say goodbye to a cat, showing clear consideration towards her parents as well, giving all the indication of being the empathic person that we know her to be by now. If we look at Peter Hitchens' comments on this, the Mail on Sunday journalist, then I'm not sure why Cheshire Police believe that making this documentary will reflect positively on them. It won't reflect positively on them, and it doesn't reflect positively on them. And I want to remind people at this point, many people following the channel will know this, and new people may not know this, that Cheshire Police are supposed to operate a Twitter account, as is indeed the case for police departments all over the world, but they ceased operating this account on the 8th of December 2024. They posted 48.2 thousand times prior to this, and then they just stopped completely. Since then, they've cowered away, battened down the hatches, and won't talk to anyone. The reason they've stopped their Twitter account is they know that they would be inundated with criticism, and they're not very brave when it comes to that. They're much braver when it comes to intimidating a young woman. So very early on in this documentary, we see the pattern that we've already known about from examining police interviews, where Cheshire Police are expecting Lucy Letby to give explanations for everything that occurs on the unit. This is stated explicitly on several occasions, as it has been stated explicitly in the past, and as it is then passed on explicitly into the court case. We later see them expecting Lucy to provide an alibi. This may be standard practice, but to expect Lucy Letby to give medical and clinical explanations for everything that happened on that unit across multiple infants as a nurse without the clinical notes is absolutely ridiculous. I will discuss this in a little more depth later on, but this idea that Lucy should have to explain everything was then carried into the court case where prosecuting barrister Nick Johnson did exactly the same thing as the police do here. We then see some footage of Lucy being held at Blacon Police Station in Chester. I'm not going to show this here. It's in the trailer that's already been released. You can obviously see it on Netflix if you wish. It adds nothing to our understanding of the case. We've never seen any previous footage of other nurses that have been arrested, and it rather suggests that Cheshire Police made up their mind before they began. Indeed, Paul Hughes indicated that this was the case when he was interviewed by Liz Hull and Caroline Cheetham of the Mail on Sunday, when he conceded that he basically had already decided that Lucy was guilty when they first arrested her. In a previous video, I examined Daniel Stonier and her interview with Liz Hull and Caroline Cheetham of the Mail on Sunday, and we learned that she was involved with the families as a family liaison officer while also conducting 2/3 of the interviews with Lucy Letby. Danielle Stonier appears here. You can see it on the screen now. Of course, this dual role seems deeply inappropriate. It seems like an immediate conflict of interest and something that would stoke the confirmation bias that was already burning strongly in this entire investigation. It rather suggests that Cheshire Police had made their mind up before they began, which, as I just mentioned, we know they had, because Paul Hughes confirmed this when he was interviewed by the Mail on Sunday himself. So Stonier goes on to say, however, when we drilled into why as to why a specific baby had collapsed, she became a lot more vague in her replies. This is after Danielle Stonier had praised Lucy's competence as a nurse and said that she was able to give very specific explanations related to nursing, which is what you would expect, of course, from a nurse. So the reason, Danielle, that she became more vague, as you describe it, is because she doesn't know. She's trying to remember things that occurred a long time ago, very complex details, and also she's a neonatal nurse. She's a knowledgeable medical professional, but even the paediatricians on the unit couldn't find explanations for why the infants collapsed. It's taken a panel of very high level, enormous expertise to understand this. It's impossible anyway, even if she had access to the clinical notes. She doesn't have access to the clinical notes. She's not a medic. She doesn't know the full circumstances and context of everything that's occurred. You're literally asking for the impossible. The idea that she can respond to this and explain every single thing that happened on the unit. I've discussed this previously in other videos, but it's an utterly stupid expectation. You're literally asking her to perform the impossible. I think, and I've expressed this before as well, what the police have really done here is apply what is a typical narrow modus operandi and then apply it to a deeply inappropriate situation. But they're too stupid to realise that they've done this. So usually they'll be investigating small-scale crime and they'll have someone in there who's a very likely culprit, and they'll say, okay, if you didn't ram raid the Spar shop, who did? And in this instance, they've done exactly the same thing, except that it's completely different, obviously, and anyone with any intellect or critical thinking ability will be able to see this, but obviously they couldn't see it. So there is then some further discussion about Lucy not remembering details. There can, of course, be many reasons for this. These things happened several years ago. It's one of many working days and so on. Just because Lucy couldn't remember something, that's not suspicious, or it shouldn't be suspicious if competent people who can understand the context are conducting the investigation. They also picked Child A at this point. The reason they picked Child A is because Lucy was the designated nurse for this infant. Lucy is not the designated nurse for multiple other infants in the court case, including the twin of Child A, Child B, and also there are numerous other people around her on multiple occasions. It's logistically impossible for Lucy to conduct these attacks. We can also see here the position of nurses for Child A, so you can see that there were two other medical professionals around her at the time. It doesn't seem remotely plausible that Lucy Letby could have attacked this infant in these circumstances. You can also see here in a previous video in which I used a tour of the neonatal unit on which Lucy worked that this is a small room. There's an image in which you can see the nursery is basically the size of a large bedroom. There's no way you can attack people without others in the room noticing. There's another image here. And on top of that, you can see there's windows from the corridor. You can clearly see into the nursery from outside of the corridor, and there's always other people around. It's a busy unit. There's people coming in and out. And quite frankly, the allegations in the first place are ridiculous. We then see the first appearance of a mother of one of the infants, which is depicted by AI. I don't want to say too much about this. It's obviously hugely traumatic for her. I feel a great deal of sympathy, and I'll reflect on this more as the video continues. What I will say is that there was some commentary in the video later on that I'm not going to go into at that point because I think it's more valid to discuss it here. about the delay in administering antibiotics for this infant, it's very clear that there were major mistakes made with regard to this child. And I know that a friend of mine commented that they felt that the mother was beginning to waver on a conviction that Lucy Letby was guilty, and that perhaps there had been failings on the unit and perhaps there had been medical errors. Now, we know that there definitely were medical errors, so obviously I don't know who this person is. I don't even know what they look like. This isn't what they actually look like. So I hope that they do continue to consider this if that is the case, and I hope they do eventually come forward, because essentially they have a very clear case of compensation, maybe stronger than anyone else in the case. We saw some kind of emotive footage at this point of corridors in the hospital that was rather dramatic. This could be criticised from my perspective and from others who believe Lucy to be innocent. It's essentially emotive imagery, but I won't be too harsh on this. It's fairly normal fare for a documentary. I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. Dr. John Gibbs then appears for the first time, and we hear him making some rudimentary remarks. I wonder why Dr. J. Ram didn't put in an appearance. I wonder if it's anything to do with the fact that he's been caught telling porkies in court, and Sir David Davis has asked the police to investigate him. Probably not. It's probably nothing to do with that. So then we hear Dr. John Gibbs mention rashes and discoloration. For people that aren't familiar with this case, these were used as diagnostic criteria by the main expert witness in the prosecution case, Dr. Dewi Evans, who we'll be hearing from later in this documentary quite imminently, actually. So this rashes and discoloration assertion has already been completely debunked. There has been a panel of experts that have specifically examined this. There are numerous problems with the idea that rashes and discoloration were significant indicators of the so-called diagnoses that were put in this court case. In reality, there aren't any diagnoses, they're just hypotheses and theories, and nonsense theories at that. So some of these problems include the fact that there were a range of different rashes observable in the infants rather than one unified rash. The specific type of rash and discoloration required was not observed, and some of the collapses of infants were not sudden. Professor Shoo Lee, co-author of this paper on pulmonary vascular air embolism, which was a critical diagnostic tool in the court case, has also been very strongly critical and is now centrally involved in the defence of Lucy Letby. This is obviously very important, as this was the only diagnostic source used by Dr. Dewi Evans, who will be appearing in the video shortly. I should point out as well, this will be known to many people, that Professor Shoo Lee, sometimes referred to as Dr. Shoo Lee as here, is just one of a panel of now 31 experts who massively outrank anyone involved in the prosecution of Lucy Letby, particularly Dr. Evans, who has become something of a ridiculous figure at this point. Dr. Evans is a completely isolated and absurd character. Hundreds of medical professionals have come forward to criticise the prosecution, and literally no one has come forward to defend his work. I should emphasise that he is conservatively responsible for 95% of the prosecution case. Dr. Evans has been challenged numerous times to produce someone from the world of paediatrics who would provide some form of tacit support for him, and he's never been able to do this, and no one else has come forward. I should also just mention briefly that these infants are very vulnerable. They were chronically unwell in many cases, and small mistakes can have huge consequences, let alone significant mistakes. This was a unit performing suboptimally, and that's a very generous assessment. There were massive sanitation problems with sewage on the wards. Sepsis was endemic on the unit. There were other viruses circulating. This is all problematic for young, vulnerable, underweight, premature neonates, and that's the reality of the situation that the police, unfortunately, were too ignorant to understand, and they were too incompetent to do any research, seemingly. So there's an interesting portion here then with Dr. John Gibbs, in which he basically says what I've mentioned previously was a central feature of the court case. He says, we didn't have any idea what was going on. Indeed, he says explicitly, we never encountered anything like this before, so we didn't know what to do. That's very evident, John. No one disagrees with that. That's why 13 infants died in a very short period of time. So what they decided to do, instead of looking at themselves, was blame a nurse for the whole thing. And what we see later in the court case is exactly what I've just mentioned. It's a lot of staff from the counter to Chester going, "We'd never seen anything like this before. We had no idea what was going on." Fortunately, when the cases were given to people who did know what was going on, they found no evidence of murder because there is no evidence of murder. Then Dr. Gibbs says that they spoke to executives at the hospital and the executives didn't seem particularly concerned. Now, I don't think that's particularly fair because, of course, the executives are going to be concerned about a lot of neonatal deaths on the unit. They're not going to hand wave this and say, "Oh, we're not really bothered that 13 infants have died." So to say they're not particularly concerned is not true. What Dr. Gibbs means is that they didn't accept what the consultant said uncritically. Now, this was a perfectly reasonable thing to do because the consultants didn't provide any evidence, as we discussed at the start of this video. Dr. Gibbs also mentions 13 unexpected deaths. Now, nearly half of these were not included in the court case, so that should perhaps give you some indication of how much the consultants understood and the kind of thing that was going on in this neonatal unit. If there had only been the deaths for which Lucy Letby was charged that actually occurred on the unit, so roughly half of the deaths that actually occurred, it would have been a relatively small spike in deaths, very small, really, considering they had deaths in previous years, and one has to wonder whether they would have even become suspicious in the first place. We are then treated to a close-up of the simian-like hands of Paul Hughes, and we hear some comments from him where he mentions 3 separate reports that were submitted. Now, we know from speaking with Stephanie Davies, who was a senior coroner's officer who worked on the investigation, who I've interviewed for this channel and I'll be interviewing again in the future, that she cited missing jigsaw pieces in one of the cases, and this eventually was transformed into something completely different and not what she intended at all. We also hear Simon Blackwell going on about deaths not being explainable. Now, this is something that really bugs me in the overall stupidity of the police, because even before I began researching this case, I knew that not all deaths are explainable, let alone all infant deaths, let alone all vulnerable neonate deaths. So if we look at this sudden and unexpected death in infancy and childhood report that was published in December 2022 by the National Child Mortality Database Programme, this is their thematic report of British hospitals. We see that of all infant and child deaths occurring between April 2019 and March 2021 in England, 30% occurred suddenly and unexpectedly, and of these, 64% had no immediately apparent cause. 64%. Bear in mind, this is in 2019 to 2021, and the figures since then reflect medical advances, medical breakthroughs. So if anything, the figures could have been worse back in 2015 to 2016, or would have been expected to be worse. So we then see Paul Hughes studying some documents in a vain attempt to understand them, and he makes the following comment. There could have been any number of legitimate explanations for why so many babies have died. So that's actually correct, Paul. Unfortunately, you didn't examine any of these explanations. So as we know from leaked documents from Cheshire Police, which I've examined previously in this video, Lucy Letby New Police Documents Analysis, and that I will go on to examine more in the future, we know that Dr. Evans, the lead prosecution witness who will be coming up shortly, didn't want to know anything contextually about the hospital. He didn't want to see previous reports from the hospital. He decided there was no need for him to know anything about infection because obviously the hospital would have caught every infection. There was no need for him to look at it. But we know that he never did any of this, so all of these explanations that Paul Hughes describes as legitimate explanations, and there could have been any number of them, those were taken out of the investigation by Dr. Evans, which of course Cheshire Police just rubber stamped and allowed him to do. Just days ago, in fact, we found out that one of the so-called victims of Lucy Letby had a deadly bug in their lungs at the time of death. This has been known about for a while. It's not surprising because Lucy mentioned there was sewage overflow at the hospital and very serious problems in many different ways. So these are the kind of very important contextual matters that were never examined by Dr. Dewi Evans. He would need to explain why he didn't bother looking for any of those things and only looked for malfeasance. I do also find myself here discussing things that I've discussed previously because Cheshire Police just said all the same things that they previously said and expressed in their Operation Hummingbird promotional film. Paul Hughes said exactly the same thing, that they wondered if it could be a bug in the water, and so forth in that film. What he didn't seem to understand at that time, and still apparently doesn't understand today, is that it doesn't have to be one solitary cause for these sort of outcomes on a neonatal unit. It could be numerous things together. It doesn't have to be a bug in the water or a viral infection or a killer nurse. All of those things can coexist. Or conversely, it can be a nuanced clinical picture with numerous factors feeding into it, which would usually be the case, and what is exactly the situation on this unit. Now that we know more about the unit, more about the infants, more about the conditions, more about the outcomes on the neonatal ward, all of the things that Dr. Evans should have been looking for but just didn't bother because it wasn't in his interest. The only difference between this film and the hastily produced production that went out on YouTube is that the Netflix one has better production values. The actual content isn't really better at all. We're then blessed again to hear the insights of Simon Blackwell from Cheshire Police, and he mentions that they needed to get together some independent, credible medical experts. Now, we know for a fact, because again documents have been leaked, that Cheshire Police made no effort to do this. They made no effort to speak to anyone other than Dr. Dewi Evans, and they allowed Dr. Dewi Evans to handwave all of the experts that the National Crime Agency recommended. Now, I'm not going to go into all of the problems with Dr. Evans here. He is thoroughly discredited at this point. I've made countless videos about his bizarre conduct and comments, and he will feature shortly in this film as well. All I can say and will say is that he cannot possibly be described as independent. He's so far away from being impartial, he's actually laughable. And it's also important to emphasise that after 2.5 years of being lambasted, not one physician has come forward to support him or anything that he says, while literally hundreds are critical of him. So for the police to claim that they needed to find independent witnesses of the highest calibre and that this was a priority is a frankly embarrassing claim, bereft of any self-awareness or evidential support. Somehow, despite the fact that it was apparently vital that Cheshire Police came into contact with independent and credible medical experts, they somehow managed to do the complete opposite of this. We then see the first appearance of Dr. Evans. Again, while watching this documentary, I was reflecting on why Dr. Evans needs so much money, considering that his front room hasn't been redecorated since 1947. We then see Dr. Evans flicking through a newspaper, and he makes this claim that he saw a story in The Guardian. A lot of this section with his usual self-aggrandising comments. We don't even know if this newspaper claim is true because he's given several previous versions of this, but there are a few reasons not to consider Dr. Evans to be in the calibre of expert that Simon Blackwell has just described. Firstly, Dr. Evans had been retired for over a decade. Even at the time of the investigation, it is now close to 20 years. Secondly, Dr. Evans had never been a neonatologist or neonatal specialist. Thirdly, Dr. Evans wasn't registered as a practicing doctor at the time of the Cheshire Police investigation. Fourthly, Dr. Evans had been strongly criticised by Lord Justice Jackson for giving worthless evidence and making no effort to give a balanced opinion. Fifthly, the Jackson case isn't the only such case in which Evans has been criticised for precisely this conduct. And finally, Evans brazenly inserted himself into the process, and Cheshire Police were frankly too stupid, too weak, and too incompetent to do any due diligence on him. It was nevertheless refreshing and pleasing to see Dr. Evans exhibiting the full range of his wardrobe during this documentary, and we now know that he owns at least 3 jumpers, which is very reassuring. He then went on to make some claims about Child O. This is the infamous case in which he decided in 10 minutes, or possibly less, that there had definitely been malfeasance. Dr. Evans claims that this infant was born in good condition, somehow failing to recall that the infant was suffering with a subcapsular hematoma. We then saw another gentleman at the front door arresting Lucy Letby for what, according to the documentary, is the second time. He was also too gutless to give his name, although they've got no problems with showing all this incredibly intrusive footage of Lucy and Lucy's family. Lucy looks terrified at this point, and this whole section is just simply gratuitous. She breaks down in tears. I'm not going to show that, but everything about her reaction screams innocence. It also conflicts with the idea that she was supposedly unemotional, when we actually see that she was very emotional at this point. There are more scenes with a cat. I'm not going to show these. Instead, I'll show you a picture of my dog. So, my dog is the lighter brown coloured dog Kiko, and this is her with Kai, who sadly passed away a couple of years ago. They were very close. Kai used to love Kiko in particular. And I know how devastating it would be to be separated from my pet, and I'm sure this was awful for Lucy. And I'll also say that people that have animals and people that have pets and that treat them well and love them are very rarely the kind of people that will commit these supposed acts. So I would just like people to reflect on that. We then return to the parent who appeared early in the video. This is approximately half an hour into the documentary, and there's been no meaningful discussion of any evidence by this point. The parent just says that she recognised Lucy. In previous videos, I've discussed the way that the police essentially polluted the perspective of the parents, so I'm not going to go over that again, but it's my view that they had a significant influence on this. We then hear from Lucy's friend again, who is shocked in complete disbelief when she witnesses this Lucy being arrested and Lucy being in the firing line and under suspicion for the first time. We then hear from Daniel Stonier, who we've heard from previously, and she tries to justify where they became suspicious about Lucy Letby and ultimately ended up charging her. Daniel says the ultimate objective for interviewing Lucy Letby was all about getting the truth as to what happened to these babies and ultimately provided with ample opportunity to provide an alternative explanation as to why these babies rapidly fell so ill or did collapse. So let me just pick her up on the idea that they rapidly fell ill. Many of them were ill from birth, so they didn't necessarily rapidly fall ill at all. So again, this is just a repetition of this idea that Lucy is to somehow explain everything that occurred on the unit, which I just view as ludicrous. It's simply impossible, and it seems incredible to me that the police seriously expected her to do this. Daniel Stonier notes that she was very knowledgeable, she was calm, referring to Lucy, but she wasn't calm, Danielle. She was scared. She was obviously knowledgeable because she's a neonatal nurse, and it's difficult to become a neonatal nurse. So then Stonier says, when talking about the processes involved in the care of these babies, she knew the answers to these questions. Yes, Danielle, she's a nurse. Of course she knows the answers to the questions. And she then continues and talks about when she was challenged over certain points, particularly her actions around the time of the collapses. I think she did become slightly more evasive. When what actually happened, Danielle, is that this all happened 3 years ago and she couldn't remember things, like Dr. J-Ram gave a completely different version in court to what he actually said at the time. And you've been asked to investigate him, but you won't because you know you've made a complete pig's ear of the investigation. This happened years ago. You can't be expected to remember everything that occurred in an instant. It's just not realistic, and you can't then compare that to nursing knowledge that you should broadly understand and should be second nature to you. We then see a classic example of this where Lucy's asked about a certain incident related to Nursery 1, and she just simply says, I can't remember who I was looking after at that time. Rather than give a dishonest answer, she just says, I can't recall that, which is entirely normal as it was years ago, and that would apply for anyone in the workplace anywhere in the world. So we then see Danielle Stonier speaking again, and she noted that Lucy would spend some time thinking about her replies. So again, Danielle, these are events that happened several years ago. If someone asked you, why did you go into so-and-so room in the police station on the 13th of May 2015 at 10 a.m, you wouldn't know, would you? Secondly, she's thinking about her answers because she knows that you've arrested her and she knows that this is extremely serious. What else would you expect her to do? You have no ability to understand people seemingly and no ability to understand human behaviour. The reality is as well that you shouldn't have been anywhere near these interviews because you were the family liaison officer and you went into the interviews with a preconceived impression, which you are now simply reflecting in this lousy so-called documentary. Then she says, these answers raise some big questions for us. Unfortunately, Danielle, as you clearly have no idea how to run an investigation, you didn't actually manage to come up with any of the obvious questions or explanations for Lucy's answers that I have pointed out, and so you have now created a chronically unsafe conviction and imprisoned an innocent woman because you're incompetent and the rest of Cheshire Police are also incompetent. Simon Blackwell then laughably uses the word forensic to describe the police investigation, so we'll just show you what the word forensic means in case there's any confusion. relating to or denoting the application of scientific methods and techniques to the investigation of crime. So I don't want to spoil the remainder of this video, but I can tell you with some confidence that you will not see anything forensic in the remainder of this documentary. So we now move on to the bane of my existence, which is the handover sheets. So at one time, I would be reminded about these all the time. It has died down a little bit, but I think there's never going to be a time in my life where I'm not required to talk about the handover sheets. The first thing to say about the handover sheets is that they're nothing to do with the indictment whatsoever. I do tire of saying this slightly, but they're completely unrelated to any of the allegations and the court case. That's why it particularly annoys me that people go on about them so much. It's nothing to do with Lucy Letby being in prison. It's nothing to do with the court case. It's nothing to do with the indictment. It's nothing to do with the allegations. Cheshire Police make a big deal about the fact here that it says keep on the box in which some of the handover sheets were stored. Now, obviously the reason for this is that Lucy doesn't want to throw them away and just throw them straight in the rubbish, or anyone else throw them straight in the rubbish, because although they're not medical records, they have some patient information on them, and she's being responsible, essentially. I must say I've discussed this again previously. I'll probably end up discussing this again in the future. But I've worked in workplaces where there was some relatively sensitive information and I've accidentally taken it home. Now, not in this quantity because we weren't dealing with as many records as nurses would. But I would probably just have thrown this away. I'm sure I've done that in the past. I'm sure sometimes I took it back into work and put it in the confidential waste. If I was Lucy, I probably would have taken it all back in. Maybe she didn't want to fill up one of the confidential waste bins. I don't care about stuff like that. I would just think, right, this is my confidential waste. There you go. It's someone else's problem now. But that's the kind, I probably would just throw it away. I don't know, but she obviously is responsible and thinks, well, I'll keep it in a box, and that would be the sensible thing to do, which is, of course, it is. And I'm being somewhat facetious about myself. I don't know what I would do in these circumstances, and of course, I tried to take stuff back that was confidential and put it in the confidential waste. But obviously, if you're in a medical department, it may be difficult to take back sheets. You can easily see how this has happened. She's put one of these handover sheets in her pocket. She's forgotten that it's there. She's taken it home. She's put it away, and then she should have taken it back to the hospital the next day, or she could have taken it back to the hospital the next day. She didn't. Then she started to build up a few, and then over a period of time, this has escalated. Very, very easy to understand. Another thing I'll mention is that Danielle Stonier describes these as highly confidential. Firstly, that implies that these documents are more significant than they actually are, and I'm not sure something can actually be highly confidential. It's either confidential or it's not confidential. Indeed, as we've seen this before in transcripts, Lucy gives a very straightforward explanation that these are just sheets of paper that have come home inadvertently in her pockets, as I've just explained. We then see Cheshire Police make the claim that some of these sheets relate to babies that collapse, but we know that over 90% of the handover sheets have nothing to do with even babies that were involved in the indictment. Not that the handover sheets that are related to babies in the indictment have anything to do with the indictment itself. It's just a coincidence. Even if the percentages were 100%, even if she only took home handover sheets that were related to the indictment, at that point you might say that looks slightly strange, but it's still an act that is nothing to do with the allegations, let alone when 90% of the sheets are nothing to do with the court case. So that should have been an answer to Cheshire Police immediately if they had any critical thinking ability or any degree of competence. The police then move on to discussing the notes that were collected from Lucy's home. It should be mentioned at this point that earlier on, Lucy is shown saying no comment when asked about the green post-it note, which is misleading as they know very well they've asked her about this several times during the interviews and she always gave a fluent answer. There has been a lot of focus on one isolated phrase from one of the several notes that were collected. The other notes don't have anything of any significance at all. This note is then supposedly forwarded as being a confession, but this note also has the following expressions: not good enough, there are no words, I can't breathe, I can't focus, kill myself right now, overwhelming fear, no hope, I'll never have children, I haven't done anything wrong, never have children or marry, never know what it's like to have a family, slander, discrimination, victimisation, all getting too much, taking over my life, everything, hate myself so much, despair, panic, fear, lost, I feel very alone and scared, what does the future hold, how can I get through it, I don't deserve to live, I don't deserve mum and dad, they are better off without me. It's very clear that this is just simply the outpourings of a traumatised woman, as indeed anyone with any understanding or qualifications has concluded. There is now a leading expert in Lucy's defence who has concluded that the notes are simply unreliable evidence, which I must say was obvious to me within 10 seconds of seeing them, the very first time I saw them, on the very first day I began to suspect that this could be a miscarriage of justice, which was the day that Lucy was convicted. Shoo Lee who has worked with several previous miscarriage of justice cases, apologies if I mispronounced your name, Mr. Gudjonsson, has written a report for the defence raising serious questions about the admissibility of the evidence. It's also been reported just yesterday that Gudjonsson has quit his job at the National Crime Agency so that he can help defend Lucy Letby because he considers this to be such an egregious miscarriage of justice. Some of the cases are named here, the Guildford 4, the Birmingham 6 and Oliver Campbell, and Lucy Letby will eventually be added to that notable list of cases that he's worked on, which are miscarriages of justice. There is then more disturbing footage of Lucy being arrested, and it becomes increasingly clear that the whole narrative used in court about having lied about being arrested in her pyjamas, which I've called Pyjamagate, is complete rubbish, and that she was telling the truth all along. In fact, her later arrests were more traumatic than those that were depicted in court. We then return to Danielle Stonier, who continues to repeat her asinine statement about whether or not Lucy could provide an alternative explanation. Danielle has concluded that now is the time to do this. So we're going to look at one infant from the Lucy Letby case, which is Child E. Child E was at high risk because he was preterm, had twin-to-twin transfusion with oligohydramnios, and his antenatal ultrasound showed reversed end diastolic flow and dilated small bowel loops. This meant blood was being sucked out of the fetus at the end of each cardiac cycle, and the intestines were likely damaged before birth. The 2 episodes of massive gastrointestinal hemorrhage were most likely due to in utero hypoxia causing stomach or small intestinal ulceration and erosion into an intestinal blood vessel, or to a vascular abnormality like Dialephois lesion, which can cause life-threatening hemorrhage. His 25% blood volume loss was likely an underestimation because more was likely lost in his intestines. Emergency transfusion with group O negative blood should have been immediately given earlier during resuscitation. Since 20% blood loss causes shock, and baby 5 lost much more, this is Child E of course, this was fatal. Patchy skin discolorations are caused by dilation and contraction of small blood vessels in the skin in response to hypoxia, which can occur in many conditions and are not diagnostic of air embolism. Zhu and Lee reported that non-specific localized patchy skin discolorations have not been reported in infants with venous air embolism, including IV air injection, and that only Lee's sign and Liebermeister's sign are diagnostic of air embolism. If air was deliberately infused through a central venous line to cause air embolism, the line will have to be reinfused with fluid to prevent detection. Collapse from air embolism occurs instantaneously. It is doubtful that this can be achieved quickly enough before other staff in the unit respond to the collapse. In conclusion, Child E died from massive gastrointestinal hemorrhage due to either intrauterine hypoxia causing stomach or intestinal ulceration or a congenital vascular lesion. Emergency blood transfusion should have been given much earlier. There was no evidence of air embolism, and a post-mortem should have been requested. So that is just one infant in the Lucy Letby case, and that is actually a relatively straightforward case in which there is a very obvious gastrointestinal bleed. Expecting Lucy Letby to recount all of this information across 17 infants is utterly absurd. Not only that, but if she had actually provided this information, Cheshire Police wouldn't have understood it anyway. what they would have done is go back to Dr. Evans and he would have said, oh no, I'm right and she's wrong, and they would have just charged her anyway. So in fact, what they were asking her to do, they were asking her to perform the impossible, and if she had actually performed the impossible, they still would have charged her anyway. This is the incompetence and stupidity of this police constabulary. There are then claims from Danielle Stonier that they found the handover sheets in chronological order. Now, based on how this was presented in the documentary, it's an outright lie, because they already told us that several of the handover sheets were found in Morrison's carrier bag that was stuffed under Lucy's bed. These are obviously in no particular order, so they can't be in any meaningful chronological order immediately, and this should also tell anyone with any insight or intelligence that this is not something that Lucy treasured in the slightest. There were also numerous handover sheets found in a bin bag in the inner garage, so that immediately torpedoes the idea that these sheets were in chronological order. They may have found some sheets in chronological order, but this would most likely be explained by the fact that Lucy took them home in chronological order and then placed them in that order as she arrived home each day. But to say all of the sheets were in chronological order is simply untrue, which is what Danielle Stonier certainly stated. And they even showed a bin bag in which they found some of these documents just to illustrate the fact that their own claim holds no water. By the way, let me just emphasise again for about the 100th time over the videos that I've made, we shouldn't even be discussing the handover sheets because they're not medical documents, they're nothing to do with the case, they're nothing to do with the indictment, they're nothing to do with any of the allegations, they are completely irrelevant. It doesn't matter if they're in date order, reverse date order, mixed up, or used as toilet paper. They are nothing to do with the indictment whatsoever. Lucy then gave what was a very obvious explanation for the handover sheets, which was there were documents she didn't want to throw in the bin, so she didn't know how to dispose of them. We're now going to move into what I have dubbed Shreddergate, in which the police firstly make a big deal out of the fact that Lucy had a shredder, because Lucy happened to mention a shredder but had likely forgotten that she had one. And this was then passed into the court case where prosecuting barrister Nick Johnson made a big deal out of it. This is so monumentally stupid because if this was important evidence, if these handover sheets actually mattered, Lucy obviously could have used the shredder to shred them. Even Hughes admitted this himself in the documentary. The reason Cheshire Police are making so much of this is because they don't understand the medical evidence. So the police consequently can't say a single thing about the medical evidence. Indeed, we're well into the documentary at this point and there hasn't been anything, hardly at all, relate to the medical evidence because they don't understand it. So Lucy could have sat there giving them explanations, they wouldn't have a clue. Just as I wouldn't have had a clue 2.5 years ago, and now I have quite a bit more understanding. We also hear this kind of boneheaded commentary from Hughes about if we keep something it's because it's important to us. That's not true, Paul. It's just so obviously untrue. This guy really is an absolute moron. He's completely incapable of disguising the fact that he's as thick as two short planks. If you stuff something in bin bags in your garage, if you stuff something in a Morrison's carrier bag and stuffed it under your bed, it's not something that's important to you by definition. Otherwise, you're arguing that every single item that I've got in my false roof now, which I've just thrown up there because I haven't got anywhere else to store it, and I won't use it again, oh, but Chris has kept all those things for a reason. No, I haven't. No one with a brain could possibly believe that. So then Simon Blackwell, incredibly, moves on to the diaries. Now, I really didn't think we'd see the diaries make an appearance in this film because there is just so blatantly, obviously, no code in this diary. But Simon Blackwell brings up the diaries and the police intend to convince us that there is a code contained within Lucy's diary. Firstly, they bring up the supposed code with the initials that has already been completely discredited and just has absolutely zero credibility at this point. They then move on to a couple of dates with asterisks, which is so pathetic to see on the screen. The fact that this is appearing in a documentary that many people will watch, and the police are seriously advancing this as evidence, is truly embarrassing. Lucy then gives an explanation for the asterisk. I'm struggling why she should have to explain an asterisk, but she gives the explanation that there was a baby that was particularly unwell, and she was asked why she did this, and she was saying, oh, I was just reflecting on this. And then the police ask her, why would you wish to reflect on this, Lucy? Well, because she's a nurse. They have to reflect on their practice. They have to reflect on the things that go wrong on the unit. That's their job. They're in a life and death situation every day. It's extraordinary that she's being asked about this. And then Hughes goes on to say, from our point of view, she was documenting the baby that got attacked on that day. Yeah, that's great, Paul, except that it's total rubbish. And also, when is the forensic part of this investigation going to start, just out of interest? Because I heard there was going to be a forensic investigation at some point. There is then reference to some more notes, which were so weak that they were never even used in court. And there were also certain phrases referenced that I couldn't even see in the bits that they showed on screen. Essentially, this is a complete non-entity claim from the police here. I also want to mention that diary entries and such like have been utilised in many previous miscarriages of justice, not least the wrongful conviction of Kathleen Folbig, in which she wrote a lot more material in her diaries that had a lot more substance than Lucy Letby, and then when experts looked at it, they said, well, this isn't a confession, this is just someone who's traumatised. Exactly the same as Lucy, essentially. The police then showed a section in which Lucy had been advised to answer no comment by her solicitor, and this was clearly used to imply that Lucy was answering no comment all the way through the police interviews. In fact, Lucy was interviewed for nearly 24 hours. It was approximately 23 hours and 40 minutes. And I have a transcript on the screen here. This would have been possibly an hour's questioning. It's hard to say how much exactly, and she doesn't say no comment once. In fact, in all the transcripts that I've seen previously, she never said no comment, and the police conceded that she was particularly cooperative. So the idea that they've tried to convey here, that she was just sat there saying no comment, no comment, no comment, is just without foundation. It's the police giving a quite deliberate misrepresentation of what actually occurred. I should also say that there's no problem with saying no comment, and you should say no comment at times, because all the police do, and certainly all they were doing with Lucy, was trying to use everything that she said against her, which is literally exactly what they did. There is then reference to there being no further deaths and collapses on the unit without it being mentioned that the unit had been downgraded. We also know that this isn't true thanks to freedom of information requests, and there will probably be more information coming out on this in the future. So they're returning to the statistics at this point, stating that it clearly shows that you were the only person present, so they're relying on this statistical coincidence that has been thoroughly discredited, as I've mentioned previously. We then see the police repeating the erroneous statistics that we've already discussed, and they move on to a question after this, which I think is rather slippery, which is, why are you responsible? Not, now, can you give us an explanation, or what do you think happened, or anything like that? Why are you responsible? So I suppose one answer to this question is, I'm not responsible, I didn't do anything wrong. And possibly Lucy, in retrospect, could have been a bit more combative in this regard in the interviews, instead of just answering the questions that she was told to do. But what she's being is compliant. You know, I would have been more keen to emphasise my innocence and not be as cooperative with the police. I think I would have been considerably less cooperative, and that would have been held against me instead. But I don't really trust them in these circumstances, and I think I would have been right not to trust them in these circumstances. So I think this was a rather unfair question, and Lucy understandably says no comment. We then move on to a bit with her friend. Obviously, she was very upset to see Lucy in these circumstances. She features again in the documentary. I don't want to say too much about this because it's not of enormous evidential relevance. We know Lucy's a good person, a normal person. We know she's innocent. People look at the evidence. Not that there's any evidence in this documentary, and comes to the conclusion very easily that Lucy's not guilty and this is an unsafe conviction. So while her friend is offering support for that notion, I don't want to dwell on that too much. We then see more footage from what is apparently the third arrest of Lucy Letby, which I won't go over in too much detail because it's just upsetting, gratuitous, etc. And we then hear Paul Hughes again talking about the scrutiny of the trial in the court and whether or not the case that they presented will stand up to this scrutiny. So what they should have been doing, rather than worrying about the scrutiny of the trial, is wondering about whether or not they were correct and wondering about whether they'd collected credible evidence and whether Lucy had actually done what they were alleging that she'd done, which we now know that she hadn't, and we now know that they didn't collect credible evidence. There is then some talk about the trial, which goes on for some time in this documentary. I'm not going to cover that. We've covered the trial previously, and there was nothing of any real substance here. I want to just deal with any kind of significant arguments that are made. We do hear from the mother again, who talks about being in court and so forth. It's not particularly interesting or relevant. There's then some comment on the Child K tube extubation case, which we know is completely farcical because it's based on a false account from Dr. Ravi Jairam, who doesn't appear in this documentary for obvious reasons. Paul Hughes then starts talking about how Lucy was creative and changed her methods. This wasn't a red flag for him that she didn't stick to one method that was working. For some bizarre reason, she started doing different things. This is simply because Dr. Evans is looking for any possible theory related to malfeasance in the investigation, of course. There was then some discussion of the air embolism theory, and Dr. Evans makes a brief appearance that I'll deal with later in the video. There's also some quite reasonable commentary about how the circumstantial evidence in this case, which we've all heard in the earlier portion of this video, is indeed extremely weak. There was then some further commentary of the usual judgmental thing of Lucy wasn't emotional enough, and there are some reasonable comments made that this is completely unrealistic. It's also important to note that Lucy did cry when she was arrested. She did cry on several occasions. She cried in court. It's not true that she was unemotional. She was broken as a human being. She was medicated. She was suffering with PTSD. We know all of these things to be true. She was a traumatized, broken woman and being put through a horrendous situation. You cannot expect to be given really demonstrative emotional reaction to things in those circumstances. It's just ludicrous. And even then she did show her emotion, as I mentioned. There was also some discourse related to Lucy's text messages. I don't really want to go into this in depth, except to say that we've seen the most supposedly incriminating text messages of Lucy Letby, and there is absolutely nothing, again, of any substance in them. Inevitably, the Facebook searches were then raised. Again, this has nothing to do with the indictment, nothing to do with the allegations. She barely looked for anything related to the indictment. She looked for thousands of things that had nothing to do with the indictment. 99% of the searches were nothing to do with the court allegations. Again, we know this is complete rubbish. Dr. John Gibbs then mentions the Insulin cases, and there is some discussion of Lucy having been tricked into accepting these. I was surprised that there wasn't more discussion of this, but with that being said, there was barely any discussion of medical evidence in this documentary. It was largely sensationalist and emotive. They did rely at this point on what I just call the "it's always Lucy" theory, in which it has to be Lucy who's doing things because she's always on duty, which of course, again, is reliant on the shift chart, is completely discredited. We then hear a bit more from Lucy's friend, who is expressing her disbelief about what happened, and then the next section is really a load of waffle about the court verdicts, which is of no meaningful significance. We then finally come to Lucy's barrister, Mark McDonald, indicating the uneven nature of this documentary. I'm going to discuss Lucy's defence in more detail before the end of this video. Mark points out the fact that the media presented a very one-sided version of events when this court case was happening, which I certainly agree with. I would also say that this case should never have gone to court in the first place, and the primary failure is with the police. I've said numerous times that I hold Dr. Evans primarily responsible because the guy is an unbelievably unreliable witness. However, it's the police's job to work this out. The police should weed him out. The police should follow other avenues of inquiry. It is essentially the police's fault that this went to court. It never should have gone to court. They got too excited about the fact that it was a big case and they got carried away with confirmation bias. And then once it had gone to court, there's always the danger of a conviction. I completely agree with what Mark is saying, but the court case should have been avoided in the first place. Mark then goes on to discuss all of the problems with the unit, everything we know to be true, everything that the police failed to uncover because Dewi Evans told them they didn't need to bother searching for it, and he didn't want to search for it himself because what he sat there doing was attempting to work out ways of possible malfeasance, as we now know from these leaked documents. So the fact that the unit was understaffed, underskilled, the sewage, the sepsis, the pseudomonas, the other infections, all of these things that have been very well documented by now, these are just completely absent from the so-called police investigation. Mark indeed notes that Dewi Evans is a liability as an expert witness, which is frankly an enormous understatement. He then goes on to discuss the fact that Lucy was given counselling and support by occupational therapy at the Countess of Chester, and that she was told to write down her feelings. This was by occupational health representative Catherine de Bager. This was reported quite some time ago. We know this to be the case. This is why it's frankly impossible to take seriously what the police state in this documentary. I mean, it really is a lousy production overall. We also hear more from Lucy's friend. There is some interesting material here about letters that she's exchanged with Lucy and the content of letters that Lucy has written to her. It's incredible that Lucy's trying to write in positive terms about her circumstances, even though she says there are no words to describe my situation. She explains that she misses her cats, which is exactly how I would feel. She says it's heartbreaking and they can't understand why I'm no longer here. They must think I'm a terrible mummy, and that's just awful to read. I know how much Kiko would miss me, and I know how much I would miss Kiko if I couldn't be there for her. It's just heartbreaking. That would be the only thing that would bother me. I could cope in solitary confinement. I'd be okay in prison. I'd be annoyed the food was terrible, but otherwise I'd just get on with it and I'd deal with it. But it would be heartbreaking to be away from my dog, and I can entirely relate to what she's saying here. And we see her blaming herself again, just reflecting the tone of the notes, the sense of guilt when she doesn't need to feel she's a bad parent to her cats. It's not her fault she's in solitary confinement. It's not her fault she's been banged away while completely innocent. She shouldn't feel that way, but this is something I discussed with Lulu Mins, the solicitor. It's kind of a very natural female reaction, a quite typical female reaction to this type of thing. So it's very sad to see that, but it's also good to see that Lucy's trying to keep her chin up. She's trying to find positive things. She enjoys going outside, and I felt this whole section was quite humanising for Lucy. The infamous New Yorker article is then mentioned, and how this has made a big difference in the case, which I definitely agree with because I hear so many people mention this. Mark then gives some explanation of why the shift chart is flawed, which I've already discussed earlier in this video. Ultimately, we just know it has no merit. And there is then some further explanation of why Dr. Evans is an unreliable witness, although for some reason the Court of Appeal has decided that he is a reliable witness, which they're entitled to do, and there's nothing we can do about that. But Mark explains that he's looking for someone to assist him, and then Professor Shoo Lee gets in contact with him. And we hear from Professor Shoo Lee, who gives an explanation on how he became involved in the case. It's important to emphasise, and I know that regular viewers are fully aware of this, that Professor Lee has authored, or at least co-authored, a key paper that is used diagnostically by Dr. Evans, who we actually hear very little from in this documentary. I'm sure he'll be disappointed about that because he loves to have his say. So the fact the documentary makers considered him to have said very little of any interest is quite telling. I personally hoped to hear more from Dr. Evans because he definitely would have put his foot in it, as he always does, but instead we mostly heard about the circumstantial aspects of the case. That's a good thing really from a sceptical perspective because we hear the medical evidence at the end, or at least some of the medical evidence is touched upon by Professor Lee, and it's not really countered at all at any point in the documentary, which of course is very difficult to do because the medical evidence used in the original court case was so poor. That's why there's been an enormous emphasis in this documentary on the circumstantial evidence, which is phenomenally weak and frankly doesn't even really meaningfully support the conviction. But we were nevertheless graced somewhat by the presence of Dr. Evans in the last portion of the film, where he makes his usual nonsensical statements. So the first thing he says is, one of the first things I did was look to the survival rates of babies in Chester prior to all the deaths and all of the collapses, and the survival rate was as good as the official figures for England and Wales for those years. This was not a failing unit. So there's a few things to unpack here. The first thing is that this is almost certainly untrue because Dr. Evans has never said this previously, but he does throw claims around randomly about everything that he's done. I mentioned earlier that he made this claim about the police had mixed the dates up. This is just completely untrue, provably untrue. We can't unfortunately prove that this assertion is untrue because we can't corroborate what he's saying. But I think it's very unlikely to be true because he's never said it anywhere else at any other time. It's just the kind of thing he would have made up on the hoof because he knows that he's being criticised. That's the first thing. The second thing is, why did you look this up? Now, I don't believe he did this for 1 second, but let's just assume for the sake of argument that he did. Why did you look up the survival rates of babies in Chester? Your job is to assess the collapses of the infants on the unit. There's no need for you to look up the survival rates of babies in Chester. If you want to know contextual information about the hospital, you could have sought this out. That was available to you. You refused to look at the Royal College report. You refused to speak to any other experts. You hand-waved all of them. You didn't, by your own admission, speak to anyone from the hospital. You didn't make any effort to understand anything contextual about the hospital whatsoever. So therefore you cannot possibly make the assertion that it wasn't a failing unit because you never looked at the circumstances at the time. Looking at the survival rates is meaningless because you need to look at the actual contextual situation for the period that you're examining. Looking at the previous survival rates is just does nothing. It means nothing. The Titanic was on its maiden journey, but if you looked at any plane or any ship that crashed or that fell out the sky and said, oh, I looked at all of its previous journeys and they were all perfectly okay, so there can't have been anything wrong on that 27th flight where it unfortunately plummeted out the sky and crashed and everyone died. It makes absolutely no sense. It's just asinine. It's stupid like everything that comes out of Dr. Evans' mouth, basically. It's a non-argument. It's rubbish. It's nonsense. That's even if he did it, and I'm very doubtful that he actually did it in the first place. Then he also says, I don't agree with Dr. Lee. He's not produced any new evidence, all he's done is produce new opinion. So let's break that down firstly before we go into the second sentence. So firstly, Dr. Evans can't disagree with Dr. Lee because he cited his findings. You, Dr. Evans, cited his findings and you're now saying you're wrong in what you said. The application of what you've done is wrong. I authored, or Professor Lee is saying, I authored the research that you're using, so you are therefore incorrect. So you can't disagree with that. You're reliant on his opinion. You can't say I agree with his opinion here, but I disagree with his opinion there about the same thing. It's just not possible to take up those two positions simultaneously. So you can't disagree with that. You can't say I don't agree. It doesn't matter whether you agree or not. You're just plainly wrong. You don't have the right to an opinion. That's the first thing. With regard to whether or not he's produced new evidence, that's irrelevant because there's 11 new items of evidence that have gone before the CCRC and it will go to the Court of Appeal. In terms of you're saying here claims that he's produced new opinion, what you're essentially saying in that case is that everything you put in the court case is opinion. Whereas in the court case you presented it as being medical evidence, as being a clinical mechanism, when in actual fact it was just some bullshit that you came up with, as we know. But here you're just admitting that it's an opinion, because Dr. Lee, who authored the paper on which you based your opinion, your so-called opinion, has said, well, you're just palpably incorrect in everything you've said. So you're saying, oh, that's just an opinion. But you can't claim that your view that you put in the court case and the so-called medical evidence that you put in the court case, you can't claim that is somehow clinically sound, that this is somehow a credible clinical mechanism, as you described it, when it's entirely based on this study. You're conceding here that you've come up with a medical opinion, which is pretty damning, really, especially seeing as that opinion has been absolutely slated by hundreds of people and no one has agreed with you. And then the second bit, he was just reading it out as if he's obviously rehearsed this. The decision of the jury was approved by 3 eminent, experienced Court of Appeal judges. Yeah, we know that. That should be the end of it, in my opinion. No one cares about your opinion. That's obviously a very self-serving opinion, Dr. Evans, because you're in the firing line. You're the most vulnerable person. You're the person who's already been disgraced and discredited and will be more disgraced and discredited in the future. And the police will stab you in the back so quickly they'll forget what to do and get confused and stab you in the front instead. So obviously when you give your opinion that it should be the end of it, that's because you don't want to get in more shit than you're in already. So then we hear from Dr. John Gibbs again, and he makes a rather intriguing statement. Some people are claiming that we consultants had a vendetta against Lucy Letby. Where's your evidence for that? So I've gone over this in several videos previously, There are documents from the Thirlwell inquiry which overwhelmingly indicate that consultants ran a 2-year campaign against Lucy Letby. Now, Dr. John Gibbs is less guilty of this than Breary and J-Ram. Breary is the ringleader and J-Ram was his sidekick, the kind of Robin to his Batman. Dr. John Gibbs was somewhat down the food chain, but he was still involved. There's overwhelming evidence of a vendetta. I mean, vendetta is essentially a qualitative term. It's debatable what exactly a vendetta is. What I can say is that Dr. Breary in particular is completely obsessed with Lucy Letby for 2 years and did everything possible to get the case to go to the police. Now, if you want to call that a vendetta, I think that's reasonable. It's open to debate whether or not it's a vendetta, but to say there's no evidence to support the idea there's a vendetta is very, very much untrue. He may have said this before the Thirlwell inquiry began, we don't know, so he may not have known all these documents would come out. Then there's some kind of self-pitying statements that he makes. I really have very little sympathy for him. And then he said, intriguingly, I don't think there was a miscarriage of justice, but you worry that no one actually saw her do it. So hopefully Dr. John Gibbs is going to have a crisis of conscience and actually recognise that the evidence that's been put forward in support of this conviction is extremely weak, laughable in fact, and the sooner that he can detach himself from Breary and J-Ram, the better that it's going to be for him. So at the end of the film there's a kind of montage of clips from the various people that have appeared, which is quite haphazard and not really worth analysing. Indeed, I analysed less in the latter part of the film because I wanted to concentrate on addressing the claims made by Cheshire Police in this film, which are very poorly founded. The one thing I will mention in conclusion is that Paul Hughes makes an interesting but thoroughly disingenuous statement. He says that Mr. McDonald is representing his client and he's got a job to do. We've always said that we would invite any challenge because any challenge is good, and so we look forward to hearing what they've got to say. Now, this is another ridiculous statement because firstly, obviously, they don't want to be challenged because their neck is on the block. This is an enormous prosecution. It's one of the most important judicial cases of recent years. It's among the more important judicial cases in the entirety of British history. So obviously a challenge to their conviction and a challenge to the prosecution is not good for them. Of course, they're only supposed to do an investigation, so they shouldn't even view it as their conviction or their prosecution, but inevitably they do. But there's no way that they should welcome any such challenge, and for them to claim this is very, very difficult to believe, frankly. But then I'd also like to point out, as I mentioned previously, that on the 8th of December 2024, Cheshire Police, who were supposed to post on Twitter every day just to provide everyday information to people in Cheshire, they suddenly stopped posting completely and they haven't started since. The reason for that is they know they would be inundated with criticism, and that's exactly the same reason they've stopped answering questions. Some very high-level people have communicated with them, written to them, asked them questions, and they just blank everyone. They've battened down the hatches, they've taken their ball home, and they're just hiding away and hoping this blows over. So the idea that they welcome a challenge is just completely unsupported by the evidence, and of course doesn't make any sense in the first place. So essentially it's just yet another stupid thing to say. They would have been better off saying no comment, but maybe they didn't want to do that after they've highlighted a few instances where Lucy did that. Before summarising this documentary, I just want to mention in conclusion that there are over 800 healthcare professionals now in the 19 Nurses organisation who all question this conviction. I've interviewed over 60 experts for my book, and I could have easily interviewed another 60 experts for a different book, and I could have a pretty good crack at interviewing another 60 experts for a third book, because I've got doctors, nurses, scientists, other experts contacting me every day. In addition to that, there are many others that have spoken out outside of the numbers that I've already mentioned. Then you have major figures such as Supreme Court Judge Lord Sumption, who's spoken out. We've heard from Sir David Davies, we've heard from Sir Jeremy Hunt. There are the 31 world-class experts that form Mark McDonald's defence panel. And then I should mention once again that every single statistician who has examined the statistical case has absolutely trashed it. None of them even take it remotely seriously. The shift chart should never be in the court case. It's a complete joke by now. The fact that it features in this documentary is just utterly embarrassing for the police, and they could have engaged a statistician, but they cancelled the work of Professor Jane Hutton. All of these people have come out. More and more people are coming out every day, and there hasn't been a single person with any credibility who has come out to support the prosecution. No one can find a medic, let alone a medic with relevant qualifications, who are willing to back Dr. Evans and his arcane theories. Dr. Evans can't find a single person. There will never be a statistician that backs the shift chart. There is no one supporting this case. There are no medics, no professional people, no serious or credible person who supports the conviction of Lucy Letby, while there is now conservatively at least 1,000 credentialed people who have challenged it, and it's probably well over 1,000. And that is why this was such a lousy documentary. I actually think it was worse than the BBC Panorama documentaries because they had longer to put it together for Netflix with more resources, and they've produced something that is more unethical and that has even less value. At least in the BBC documentaries, they did touch upon the scientific evidence that was barely even referenced here, and certainly not by the police. Now, we know why it wasn't referenced by the police. They don't understand it in the first place. But to have a documentary that lasts 90 minutes for a conviction that is founded on medical evidence, then you barely discuss the medical evidence, is clearly not a great strength of the documentary. The scenes depicting the arrest of Lucy were unquestionably unethical. That would arguably apply if she was cast iron guilty, but considering the overwhelming doubt surrounding her convictions, it's very difficult to defend this, even from the perspective of Netflix. I understand that Netflix is an internet business. They need to produce content, and when they set out on this path, they probably thought Lucy Letby was definitively guilty. It's obviously to their credit they've acknowledged that this isn't the case, even though this was an uneven documentary. But they really had no choice because they would have looked utterly ridiculous to pretend that it was an open and shut case. There isn't much that I can add about the contributions of the police, except to say that they have once again demonstrated all of the mistakes that we knew they'd made previously. The anecdotal or circumstantial case that they put in court has no merit whatsoever, and yet they remain besotted with the documents that they've collected from Lucy's house, even though they have nothing to do with the indictment whatsoever. Police officers in this film who were centrally involved in the investigation made all sorts of very poorly founded assertions which they seemed to believe were self-evident. That says more about them than the assertions themselves. Overall, considering the enormous resources of Netflix and the fact that they were given footage that no one has seen before, it was rather a damp squib of a documentary, providing nothing new and nothing to advance the discussion in any meaningful way. There was nothing in here which altered everything that we already know and understand about the conviction of Lucy Letby. So we already know that Lucy Letby does not remotely fit the description of a serial killer. There is no plausible motive for her supposed crimes. The anecdotal evidence used in court was worthless. Lucy Letby was scapegoated, whether consciously or unconsciously, by consultants on the unit. The police would later involve those consultants in the investigation, just one way in which the Cheshire Police investigation was thoroughly incompetent. The counter to Chester was a failing hospital, understaffed and underskilled, with raw sewage on the unit, endemic sepsis, other deadly viruses, and a litany of other problems. The infants were considerably more unwell than was presented in court. The theories of Dr. Dewi Evans have all been decimated by far superior medics in great numbers. No one has come forward to support Dewi Evans, while hundreds of experts across multiple specialisms have come forward to question the verdict. In July, my book, Reasonable Doubt, Examining the Case of Lucy Letby, will be released. The current estimated time of arrival for this book is the 9th of July. Reasonable Doubt examines all of the circumstances surrounding the Countess of Chester and the conviction of Lucy Letby, from the situation at the hospital through the evidence used in court to the police investigation. This rather poor effort from Netflix was one final desperate and pathetic roll of the dice from a police constabulary that knows it has screwed up really badly. Cheshire Police have no cards left to play. It's our time now.